The Between by F DuBois. The man sprinted in bursts between steady runs to replenish his breath for the next dash. The leaf-covered ground was wet and uneven. Branches whipped at his face as he panted, shielding himself with his arms as best he could. Sweat glazed his face, and condensed tendrils trickled downward as he wiped them away from his eyes. He was cutting this too fine. The glow from the moon was barely sufficient to light his path through the dense woods, but he knew the terrain well. How he had found himself so far from home on foot at such a late hour was beyond him. He wasn't normally this careless. He knew only too well that things could get complicated if he wasn't there when the time came. He emerged from the woods panting and took a moment to catch his breath. Condensation escaped from him into the night as he stood with his hands on his knees atop the sloping field. The stars chattered in their gibberish Morse code, and he couldn't help but pause, time he didn't have, to let them wash over him. Every time he looked upon the boundless expanse of the night sky, he felt as though it was the first time he'd set eyes upon the heavens. He stood upright and felt the stab of a stitch in his ribs. "God damn it," he said, and broke into a run down the slope. He slipped once, his feet rushing away from him, causing him to fall on his ass. He painfully pushed himself to his feet again and continued his run. He ran across the grassy field, into and through a cornfield, and had to skirt around the edges of a ploughed field before finding the gate he sought. He climbed over it and ran down the tarmacadam road, hoping he wouldn't meet any traffic. His boots began to hurt his feet with each footfall on the hard surface. Mercifully, the night air was refreshing against his face, a cool breeze helping him along his way. He rounded a bend and saw it in the distance, his house. There were no lights on. He just might make it. He made one final push and ran until his ribs screamed bloody murder. He crashed through the small gap in his decorative hedge and slammed into the back door of the house harder than he had intended. Gasping, he bent down and with hands shaking, overturned the duck-shaped stone where the key was concealed. He unlocked the door, stumbled inside, and flicked on the lights in the kitchen. He stood, head bowed, leaning on the kitchen worktop, fighting to consume as much oxygen as he could. Finally, he had drawn sufficient air into his lungs and blood that he could breathe through his nose with deep, slow intakes of breath. He stood upright, as sweat appeared to explode from every pore, now that the night air wasn't there to counteract his overheating body. The knock at the front door came. He composed himself, straightened his coat, and walked towards the nocturnal visitor. Remembering the mirror on the hall stand, he removed and tossed his coat over it. He turned on the doorstep light. "I don't have all night, you know," said the voice on the other side. The man smiled to himself and opened the door. "Evening, son," he said, and embraced him tightly. "Get off," said the boy. "Had a few sups of whiskey, eh?" The man released his son and held him at arm's length. "Aye, I suppose that's what it is. It's good to see you, boy." "Yeah, I know I'm running late, Dad. No need to take the piss." The man let his son pass and closed the door. "Good night, son. Get up to anything interesting," he said. The boy thought for a moment and began to take his coat off. You know, this and that," he said. The man nodded to himself. The boy never could say with any great detail what he'd been up to. It was probably better that way. Francis sat on a stool at the worktop in the kitchen as his son Jason busied himself. He watched his teenage boy fail to conceal the effects of the alcohol he'd illicitly consumed on his night out as he made a crisp and butter sandwich. Francis wasn't going to reprimand the boy for doing the very thing he himself had done at that age. Not anymore, at least. Jason was oblivious to just how Francis was watching him. Had he been sober, he might have realised his father was on an emotional precipice, deeply moved by the mundane actions of his boy preparing himself some food. Francis was glad for the foggy disposition of his boy. He imagined it played its part in Jason's ritual, keeping him centred. Francis rubbed his throat. The chafed feeling always seemed to accompany Jason's arrival. Jason sat opposite his father and crunched into the sandwich, biting more than half of it away. He chewed laboriously as the bread and crisps compacted into his cheeks, comically bulging them out of shape. Francis smiled at his son. His eyes wandered to the deep gash in Jason's left temple. Francis moved his gaze back to the sluggish eyes of his mildly intoxicated boy. "So, any scandal or crack from your night out?" asked Francis. Jason chewed noisily and swallowed, chasing the food with a gulp of tap water from a glass. "No, not much really. Just met the lads and went to the club. Usual stuff. I missed the bus, mind you. I got a lift with Dougie from down the road." "Is that right?" said Francis in a monotone. "Aye, but I'll tell you what, I'll not do that again. He's a madman on the roads. There was a wreck of us in the back seat, so not enough belts to go round. The crack was good, but it wasn't safe, you know. And don't go giving me a bollocking either. I know it was stupid. I'll not do it again. Can't remember getting to the house, mind. It's all a bit of a blur." "I fear I'll do that to you," said Francis. This part of the conversation was always the most delicate. "Who said I was afraid?" said Jason. "It was either the fear or the drink," said Francis with a smile. "Seeing as I'm too young to drink, it must have been the fear so," said Jason. Francis got to his feet and lifted Jason's plate and glass and walked to the sink. "Right, off to bed with you," he said. "All right, Da. I'll see you in the morning," said Jason. "Give your old man a hug before you hit the hay." "Oh, for fuck's sake," said Jason as he threw his arms around Francis. "Love you, Da. Good night." Francis squeezed his boy hard and his chest swelled. "Good night, son," he said. He released Jason from the embrace and watched him leave the kitchen and listened to him ascend the staircase to his bedroom. Francis washed the dishes and sat himself in his armchair by the stove and waited. Once Jason was settled, Francis took a chair from the kitchen and went upstairs. He opened Jason's bedroom door, just enough, and sat on the chair in the hallway. He watched over his boy, who lay peacefully in his bed. Sleep called for Francis, but he resisted as best he could. He had a flash of his boy in that same room, but instead of a bed, he lay in a coffin. The gash on his forehead professionally filled in. Francis awoke with a start and looked to find Jason. His bed was empty. Francis's watch was ended once more. He lifted the chair and walked back down to the kitchen, sitting himself back into the armchair. Francis rubbed at the chafing on his neck, absent-mindedly. The stove only gave off a bit of warmth now, but it was enough to carry Francis into a sleep in between whispering sobs. The man sprinted in bursts between steady runs to replenish his breath for the next dash. How he had found himself so far from home, on foot, at such a late hour, was beyond him.